Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for the kind invitation, and thank you all for being here so late. I was telling Anna that in the UK it would be impossible to hold a seminar at 6:30 in the afternoon. We have those lunch seminars because English colleagues, British colleagues would not conceive of staying over working hours. Yeah. But anyway, I'm here, perhaps on their behalf, doing something I've never done, speak at 6:30. Usually there's other things I do. My brain switches off around 5 o'clock. But hopefully I'll keep you interested for around 45 minutes, 50 minutes, perhaps less, and then I'll invite questions. I'll open it to the floor. I think I'm just about able to take questions in French, but I'll answer in English. But I think you know, anything really that's related to this, or perhaps to your larger debate on political psychology. I'm a psychologist. I'm a political psychologist, social and political psychologist. I've been a Loughborough for a while now, and have been working in political psychology for 12, 15 years maybe, and I've been interested in the issue of language, discourse. I'm part of what's known as Discourse and Rhetoric group. I'm part of you can see the Center for Research and Communication in Culture, and we are a group of academics with an interest in how language is used to construct the world, and how that's, for me at least, how that's part and parcel of politics. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the dilemma, because language and politics, you know, that they I don't know, they go together. Is language you know, sufficient means of understanding, I don't know, voting behavior, political participation, or political speeches, or do we need some extra dimension which will help us understand the whole, so to speak, what we call politics? So now, I as a psychologist, I'm also trained classically. You know, I've been introduced to cognitive psychology. I know my psychology very well, although I'm now critical of it. So I want to contrast two key approaches to language and politics, to understanding political language. One that comes with roots in cognitive science and information processing. I'll talk about cognitive complexity today. Also going to introduce rhetorical and discursive approaches in psychology, which look at the same thing, political language, political discourse. I want to show whether one can possibly replace the other, whether there's any purchase in any critique of a more established paradigm, which is mostly that coming from social and cognitive sciences. Now, do we think that we need a definition of politics when we're doing political psychology? Most of us will say yes. Now, where do you get your definition of politics? I got a few that I use with my students, and the ones which I really like, which come mostly from political science, but also from other areas of inquiry. This is one from Murray Edelman, political scientist. Now, it's not quite a definition of politics, a textbook definition, but it tells you what politics is about, because politics does visibly confer wealth, take life, imprison and free people, and represent a history with strong emotional and ideological association. Its processes become easy object upon which to display private emotions, especially strong anxieties or hopes. So politics, it's about what it does to people and what it embodies, as it were. Yeah? And there's nothing about language yet. I mean, my problem with definitions of politics is they do not talk about the language of politics, as if language was peripheral to how politics is being done. But of course we know that the reverse is true, because we look around us, it's all political language, isn't it? It's all claims and counterclaims, it's all rhetoric. So how come that our definitions of politics do not include a dimension which is more directly about language? Now, if you go on with your search, you might discover that there are definitions of politics that include language, mostly those coming from critical discourse analysts, people who look at discourse of politics more directly. And here's an example from Chilton and Schaffner, a book from 1997. There's other examples in the work of Ruth Wodak. There's a wonderful book she did recently, The Discourse of Politics in Action, about how European politicians do politics. There's one lovely chapter on her following a European politician in his or her everyday life. Politics is embodied, isn't it? Walking corridors, and it's like being a university student, sitting in lectures and filling the hard seats and walking on those corridors and queuing for the bus. That's what being a student is, as it were. You know, it's that embodied experience. Now, politics is a bit like that, isn't it? It's an embodied experience. Now, Chilton and Schaffner argue that it's surely the case that politics cannot be conducted without language. It's probably the case that the use of language in constitutional social groups leads to what we call politics in a broad sense. Now again, we don't have to agree with definition like this just by virtue of reputation. We need some kind of evidence. We need to be able to analyze discourse. We need to be able to have tools in order to make sense of what this definition is about. Yeah, there's no point defining politics as something that's conducted through language if you don't have the tools of analyzing language itself. Yeah? And I want to give today 2 examples of contrasting approaches that do that take the language of politics very seriously, but they approach it very differently. Yeah? The first one is based on ontology or epistemology that's referential. The referential theory of language, what's sometimes called internalist cognitivism. Yeah, the person, there's something in the person that drives us. There's something that makes us say and do what we do, as it were. And I'm going to give you today the example of cognitive complexity. Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah, excellent. I'm just waiting for something. Bonsoir. The second approach is a contrasting one, which is based in a slightly different epistemology that performative theory of language, and that comes under the heading of rhetorical and discursive constructionism. I'm going to talk about rhetoric of self and social identity. But I want to give you a bit of background before I contrast the 2 approaches. There are many. You might tell me that there's approaches in political philosophy that take language very seriously. There's a philosophy of language, is there? You know, there's Wittgenstein and others. And political psychology tends to be perhaps more about language in these 2 conceptions. Yeah, perhaps limiting. And if you have any other ideas, of course, I'll be grateful for those. Now, let me start with perhaps one of the most influential papers in political science, the work of Philip Converse in 1964, that looks at the formation of belief systems and looks at how political knowledge and political information is distributed in populations. Yeah? The basis of any political stance is that you are able, as an individual, to absorb political and contextual information. Now, Converse's argument is very simple. He uses the metaphor of the mountain range. You can see those. I put them together. They're supposed to be pyramids, and you can see that at the top you have the very differentiated elite apex. Yeah, the elites are the ones usually that can make sense of political information. Yeah, they can distinguish what's good, what's bad, and they can form clusters of organized belief systems. Whereas the grassroots is where confusion lies, as it were. Yeah, you see, there's overlap. Yeah, there's not much differentiation at the level of the grassroots, the individual, the ordinary citizen. Yeah. Converse, you may remember. Have you come across the paper? He was a pessimist. He believed that ordinary citizens cannot form political opinions, integrated political opinions. Yeah, they'll believe something and they'll believe something else, and it'll be a mess. Whereas the elites are in charge of political information, and the direction of political information is from the elites to grassroots, to ordinary citizens, as it were. Now, given that that's the case, or at least that that's a suggestion that comes from Converse, then one can be engaged in a process of understanding how these belief systems are organized. Yeah? And when you do that, you need something to underpin that project. Now, perhaps the most influential paradigm in, let's say, the social sciences and is the information processing model. Is this idea that you can look at information, including political information, something that's stored in symbolic form by the mind. Yeah? And you see this metaphor of the network. Yeah? I mean, memory is one of those. Cognition, memory is one example. And so memory is made up of this associative network, and there's long-term memory and working memory, and they come in relation to each other, but within that kind of network. Yeah. Now, the way it's usually described, it's described as a stage model. You have to pay attention. If you don't pay attention, it's not in your perceptual field, as it were, and then you have to interpret it as a stimulus. Then you have to evaluate it, and then you store it in memory, as it were. Part of it, most of it happens in working memory, and then everything gets stored in long-term memory, so to speak. Now, this is what we refer to as the input-output paradigm. Yeah, the computer, it's its basis, isn't it? There's something that comes in on this side, the input side. There's something going on. Yeah, there's the black box. We don't know much about it, and there's something that comes out, as it were. Yeah, and we have to look at the consequences. We have to look at the products of thinking in order to work out what's happening in between. Yeah? Now, you can see how political scientists, since Converse and you know, since 1950s and even earlier, have been interested, have started to understand how the mind is organized, in that it operates at that level. And that's a level of complexity. Yeah, you see that associative network is a complex network. Yeah? And this is one of the ideas that some psychologists are quite keen on, the idea of complexity. The mind is complex. Political communication is complex. We need to understand how it's organized. Now, if you look at Taber and Tetlock, and you take the Oxford, Handbook of Political Psychology, and look the chapters by Taber and Tetlock and others, and you'll see that political discourse is defined as the expression of cognitive states and schemas. Yeah, associative networks. That's what political discourse is about. Basically, it's about information processing complexity. Yeah? That's why you're studying. Yeah? You're studying how those schemas and cognitive states come together in a very, very complex system, yeah? which is the system of the political mind, as it were. Usually for the elites. Yeah? We tend to look at politicians, don't we? There's a bias towards. We tend to study less ordinary people, but we tend to look at politicians. We like the elites. We also think that the elites are more organized than the ordinary individuals. I just show you Converse. They're organized, so we can look at them as an example of cognitive complexity. Now, this is the notion I want to focus on today, and it's one of the notions introduced by Philip Tetlock and others, Peter Sodfeld in North America. It's a highly influential notion. It's slightly out of favor currently, but it's a notion that can help us understand how could we possibly look at politics from the vantage point of a schematic organization. Now, if you want to take cognitive complexity very briefly, you're looking at things like mental flexibility versus rigidity. You'll be looking at levels of information seeking, as it were, noticing things and processing different bits of information in a political environment, as it were. You'll be looking also at some kind of synthesis in a superordinate schema, as it were. You're looking at higher cognitive processes, yeah? Analysis, synthesis. Now, how these elements are put together is the business of the political psychologist, yeah? I'm going to give you some examples in a little while. Now, before I give you actual examples of how talk is analyzed using the notion of cognitive complexity, with what's known and called integrative cognitive complexity, I just want to highlight one of the key images of the person in this area of work. You know, there's always a, you know, the philosopher has a certain image of the person, because, you know, we are supposed to be certain types of beings, as it were. Yeah. Now, for cognitive scientists, the person is akin to the cognitive manager. Yeah. Do you know your head of department? He's a manager. Do you know your dean? He's a manager. Yeah. He's supposed to manage people. He's supposed to delegate. He's supposed to use high-level thinking. Yeah. More cognitive resource than anyone to get things done. Now, that's according to Zoidfeld and others. This is what the cognitive manager is. The individual uses intense resources when trying to make sense of political information, yeah, and allocates resources based on importance, yeah. It's a pragmatic. This is a pragmatic approach, yeah. And the cognitive manager is not a fool. No, he or she thinks very carefully and allocates resources based on importance, yeah. A bit like your head of department. He doesn't allocate money just because he likes you. But he's very careful, yeah? He allocates resources based on importance. Also, the cognitive manager, the person, realizes the existence of individual differences in cognitive styles, yeah? People will work differently depending on the amount of resources they committed and based on what they're doing, based on what they're trying to understand, as it were, yeah? Now, this is what Michael Billig would call the bureaucratic image of the person. You may have come across the metaphor, the work of Michael Billig. He's the bureaucrat. He or she is the bureaucrat. He's filing. He's got a system. He's moving. He's shifting paperwork from one file to another. He's the one that allocates resources. It's a pragmatic vision, but it's the vision of the bureaucrat, as it were. Now, this has consequences. If you read Billig, you'll know this has consequences for how you can start to think about politics. Now, I'm going to give you some examples that come from research that use this metaphor of the cognitive manager as a background for what's being done. Now, let me start with the work of Philip Tetlock, who's one of the main proponents of cognitive integrity complexity. You can read these yourselves. What it is, integrity complexity refers to the variety of aspects of an issue that a person can recognize. Yeah? A more differentiated politician would recognize policies that have multiple, sometimes contradictory effects that cannot be easily classified on a single relative dimension. Yeah? If you read the next quote, the development complex connection among differentiated characteristics, yeah, need to be integrated. The complexity of integration depends on whether the individual perceives the differentiated characteristics as operating in isolation, low integration, in simple patterns, moderate integration, in multiple complex patterns, high integration. Yeah, it's an image. Can you picture this? A person who's doing. Imagine you're given an exercise, and you either can use very different complex strategies and make connections between the elements and work out the problem, or you can just take a very simple approach and say, this is black and white, this is good and bad. That's low integration, yeah. Now, so people, in terms of individual differences, people would locate themselves on a spectrum from low integration, low complexity, yeah, to high complexity, as it were, yeah. Now, you can use this as a framework to look at politicians, to put politicians on a spectrum and see what kind of people they are. Now, that's what Tetlock and colleagues have done, with mostly looking at politicians' speeches. The research that Tetlock conducted in the 1980s and also in the 1990s looked at the relationship between cognitive style and political ideology. US senators from the different parties, and what the research showed, they coded statements, language, political language use in terms of cognitive integrity complexity. You can have a look. There's a coding matrix you can use to code people on whether they're low or high or moderate. Now, what the research shows, and it was quite robust, that there's a link between political ideology and integrative complexity. It showed, for instance, that liberal and moderates both advanced more complex statements on policy than did conservatives. Now, they also controlled for age, party affiliation, education, years of service, and age, and still found the liberals and moderates advance more complex statements than conservatives. Now, that's very interesting, because someone might say, hang on, but what about the experience? I've been in the House of Commons for longer than you, therefore my discourse can be a bit more complex. Now, according to this, if you control for age, education, doesn't matter. Yeah? So it's something to do with the way the mind is organized. That's an assumption, that integrative complexity, it's something that goes together with how belief systems are organized. Yeah? Now you can see how perceptions of politicians can be constructed on the basis of such statement. Yeah, if someone is low in integrative complexity, someone can be described as a bit dogmatic as well. Yeah, black and white. Whereas someone's a high on integrative complexity, someone's a bit more flexible, a bit more, engages with the issues of the day in a more flexible manner. Liberal, I mean, that we call them liberals, moderates, as it were. You can see the political message here. I mean, I'm not saying that Tileaga was after the politics of it, but by describing conservatives as let's say, more dogmatic or less integrative complex, you're also perhaps implying that there's something wrong with that kind of ideology. There's always a public perception of a person in terms of the politics, as it were. I mean, if you follow Brexit, I'm not going to talk about it, but you look at Johnson, you think, oh, he's very different from Theresa May, yeah? Or Blair is very different from David Cameron, yeah? You got your own presidents and prime ministers, and you can see that they're very different, and but what differentiates them? That's the question. Well, one is nicer than the other. One belongs to my party. That's not really a way of differentiating them. The point is that you can have some objective measure that would distinguish between different kinds of politicians. Now, here's an example. There's another study conducted, I think, in 1997. The paper reads, this is a paper about Gorbachev, failed leader or successful peacemaker. Now, what they've done, the researchers, Peter Sertfeld and colleagues, have analyzed his speeches, and they realized that Gorbachev was perceived in the West as being a reformer, as we know now well, and he was high on integrated complexity, but he was not the same on domestic policy. So at home, his discourse was very different to what he offered the West in a way. So he rated very highly for foreign policy on integrated complexity, but when it comes to his political discourse at home, he was quite low, so quite dogmatic, quite black and white, as it were. So he appeared pragmatic and reasonable and flexible to the West, but his perception at home was, as we know, quite different. That might explain why Western leaders liked Gorbachev and the politicians, because he was speaking their language. His reform discourse resembled moderate Western reformers. So interesting. I mean, it's interesting to look at language and what you see. This can tell us something about where a person might be positioned on the complexity of their political discourse. Here's another example. Clinton. We're going back to 1992 or something like that. Now, his public and expert image was that of a man who operated the high levels of integrative complexity. But if you look at the work that's been done by Reicher and colleagues, I'm not sure you can see the table, but he scores the lowest out of all presidents going back years. So interesting, the public perception puts him very high. He's a very complex politician, we like him. But actually, if you look at his discourses and use the matrix of integrative complexity, you find that he scores the lowest of all the presidents, including conservative presidents. Interesting, again, you see there's always a difference, political psychology argue, between the public persona and what you can find out by doing systematic systematic research using, in this case, this particular approach. So it's not all. See, there's a dilemma there. So you know, how do you describe such a politician? Now, what you see and what you start to see is that there might be some sense of impression management. There must be a sense in which politicians use certain identities to address different audiences. The audiences at home, the audiences abroad, yeah? The discourse is not simply about whether they appear liberals in a generic sense, as it were, yeah? I'm going to talk about Trump in a moment. Trump is vilified by everyone, but if you look carefully, his discourse is crafted for a certain audience, depending on the context. It seems to us that he is who he is, because we only get to see certain snippets of his talk. But if you did a comparative research, you will actually find, and I'm going to give you an example today, research shows that he's actually quite good at manipulating social identity. He appeals to audiences on the basis of the social identities that he himself is supposedly embodying. I'm going to return to the issue of social identity in a moment. How's this? Does this make sense? Yeah, so far so good. Now, another example of integrative complexity. I mean, if you give a talk, if you're a politician and talking about the aspects where there's some idea of management, of display of expertise, you can see that politicians who address smart audiences, which are interested but not entirely on their side, would use communication strategies which imply two-sided communication, high integrative complexities on one hand, on the other hand. Yeah. Whereas if you address a less smart audience who's is uninterested but it's on your side, you can use what's known as one-sided communication, low integrative complexity. Yeah? You can use let's say that's Trump with his supporters. Yeah, when I say smart, I don't mean stupid. I mean people who are there by virtue of being there. They don't have we like Trump, that's why they're there, but they're on your side. So politicians don't have to resort to complex arguments to convince one that the policies are worthwhile. Yeah. That's another way of looking at politicians doing politics, as it were. Now, what you find with integrative complexity when it comes to language is that rhetoric itself poses problem for scorers. I mean, you don't need to worry about this, but if you're interested, you can go to the paper by Tetlock and look. There's Baker Brown has edited the matrix for doing cognitive complexity. Now, what you find with that matrix is that there are indicators that would render a statement unscorable. So you look at the sentence and you need to score it. Yeah. Now, if you have reported speech or politicians using idioms or sarcasm or factual description, those will come out as unscorables because where do you put them? Which categories do they belong? They belong to the categories of language, but they're very difficult to capture in a systematic grid that looks at only what's straightforward. I am for this, I am against that. There's also things like however or yet, but can confuse people who code integrative complexity. So you wonder then, what do they capture? I'm still yet to see a full protocol, but it'd be interesting to see what's the protocol like if all that we take for granted in language, reported speech, features of language that we take for granted in ordinary conversation, are not actually captured by a coding matrix of this type. So then, where do you go from here? Now, you don't have to throw the baby with the bathwater. You don't have to renounce cognitive psychology and say, no, we're not going to do that. But you need you need a bit more sophistication. You need to be able to look at language in its own right. I mentioned Michael Billig. Now, I'm the proponent of a strand of work that follows from Michael Billig and others that looks at language, at thinking, as something that's intrinsically rhetorical. There's Arguing and Thinking, which is a wonderful book that gives you a foundation for doing social psychology of language, for looking at, it's not about political discourse, but it's about how the mind, how thinking is interesting and rhetorical, and how what we call political attitudes are actually matters, stances in matters of public controversy. Yeah, there's nothing necessarily that's cognitive about political attitudes. And I'm going to show you in a moment that there's something else that we might look at in order to understand political attitudes. There's also a book I recently edited with Elizabeth Stoker at Loughborough. It looks at discursive psychology. That's the generic name that's given to studies in rhetoric and discursive psychology that I address in my work in political psychology. So if you have an interest, do have a look at that. Now the book is notable, not because I edited, but because it contains references to classic texts in discursive psychology. So you can look at commentaries on classic texts of the discipline. We just taken the texts and we invited contributors to give a commentary on those classic texts. So if you're interested in discursive psychology, have a look at that as well. But don't miss Billig. Billig is a wonderful writer. You may have come across his work already. He was actually my PhD supervisor at Loughborough for 3 years. He was my colleague then, and then he's recently retired, which is a shame. But he was a wonderful person. Anyway, enough of Billig. So, how can you contrast? How can you introduce what's different in discursive psychology? It's not cognitive, yeah. It's about how people construct versions of the world, isn't it? And they use language in doing so. Second, we perform actions in talk, and you can go back to Wittgenstein. And, that's the underpinning of the project. One of the underpinnings of the discursive project: explanations, justifications, blame. How people construct identities and social identities. I'll show in a moment how important they are. And third, how speakers use rhetoric to act on the world. Again, you see this action orientation. It's very Wittgensteinian, although it's lost some its original thrust, but it's about action orientation. And you can see this I've divided this for simplicity in 2 strands of work. Micro-level analysis of discourse includes conversation analysis, for instance, where you can look at political discourse for overlaps, for things that happen in discourse that leads to certain actions being performed. Here's an example. You may come across the book, Max Atkinson from 1980s. One of the things he analyzes there, which I think it's brilliantly done, is rhetorical claptraps to generate applause. How do politicians generate applause? Do you think they just do it? It's just magic? No. Well, you can use 3-part lists and things like that. And here's an example from Margaret Thatcher. She's doing it right there. She goes into, I am forever fortunate, having a marvelous deputy, etc., who's wonderful in all places, all times and all things. Willy Wallow, that's his name, and then overlap, and then you see applause as well. Now that 3-part list is what invites applause, as it were. Yeah, it's a device that conversationalists, research and show that politicians can use those triggers, so to speak, to generate applause, as it were. So there is this strategic part of doing politics. Now this is the micro level. I don't have time to look at micro level, but I want to look at some aspects on the macro level. Now the macro level, I'm not a sociologist, so don't take my word for it. Micro, meso level, I'm just using these to orient the audience here. Now at the macro level, I placed what I call a social linguistics of leadership, because that's what politics is about, isn't it? The elite is leading, is showing leadership, whether we're talking of a president, whether we're talking of a member of parliament. Now, how can you understand then this leadership in context when you look at language? Now, you can look at identities again. How speakers construct common identities with the audience, what we call rhetorical identification. Yeah, you can declare identities as a politician in order to achieve specific rhetorical ends. Yeah, you can, of course, in doing so, you manage self-presentation. Yeah, you present yourself as a certain type of person. Yeah? You can also use what you know that the audience already knows, those commonplaces, those moral values which we all share, which are beyond disagreement, like justice and mercy and freedom and responsibility. Yeah? No one disagrees when politicians talk about justice and freedom, yeah? Because we all take those values, you know, as granted. Yeah? Now, let me give you some examples. You recognize the gentleman, Barack Obama, a wonderful, wonderful orator, isn't it? And look, this is from his Nobel Prize lecture. Look how his discourse is organized. Yeah? Look, what is he talking about? He's talking about the service and sacrifice of all men and women in uniform, as it were. He's talking about America, but at the same time he's talking about the world of nations, isn't he? Yeah? Look at the way he uses the small words, the we, us. He talks about self-interest, but also implies a broader interest, as it were. Yeah? Now you can see how he uses what we usually refer to as pronouns of distance, me and you, us and them, in order to build the discourse of togetherness, as it were. Yeah? He positions himself as the reasonable politician. Yeah? In linguistic terms, he addresses what's known as a universal audience. There's a term in linguistics. There's a universal audience. The audience which is right-thinking, like us. Yeah? When a politician like Obama says those words, we all nod and say, yes, he's right, because we are the universal audience. We believe in universal values, and we would not let anyone, you know, alter those. And again, it's all about identity, isn't it? It's all about the use of pronouns. It's all about the positioning in terms of, in relation to an audience. You know, rhetoric is quite complex. Now, would it be useful for us to know whether Obama is low or high on integrative complexity? Would that change that? We might find that he's quite low on integrative complexity, but does it matter? What he does is he does it through discourse, through the use of words, through the use of metaphors, through the use of pronouns, as it were. Yeah. Here's another example. Theresa May, no one's seen her, although she was at the opening of State Parliament today. The Queen is back. And the House of Commons is back at work today, this morning. Now, was very keen, of course, when she called that election, that the country that she works for, and she works for everyone. Yeah? Look again how she puts herself forward as that politician that embodies the positive values of decisiveness. Yeah, acting on principle, listening to reason. She's the caring politician. Yeah. Look at that repeated list. Look at those words that she uses. And look how she ends a confident move. That's a record of which we should be all proud. Now again, identity construction seems to be key here. There's nothing cognitive here. We don't need to know whether she's high or low, whether she's moderate. We need to be able to analyze the language. We need to be able to understand what is being done, how she's constructing herself, and what are the values to which she champions. Here's another classic example from the work of Rapley in 1998. This is a classic example of discursive analysis of political discourse. If you come across the paper, it's on Pauline Hanson's maiden speech in the Australian Parliament. Now, what's happening here? I'll let you read this. Look at the use of social identity, on the role of social identity in constructing what is a maiden speech, her introductory speech to the Australian Parliament. And look at the bit towards the end. My view of issues is based on common sense, and my experience as a mother of 4 children, a sole parent, and a businesswoman running a fish and chip shop, as it were. Yeah? Now, who can deny that? Yeah? But look, multiple identities, isn't it? Very varied and multiple identities. Yeah? Again, there's not much that's cognitive here. We don't need to know. We don't need to know whether her belief system is actually based on actual experience. We are told it's experience. But that's quite a powerful device the politicians use in order to appeal to an audience, as it were. Yeah? Regardless of political, regardless of political affiliations, you were. And researchers show that social identities, constructing and managing social identity in talk is one of the most powerful tools that politicians can use. Yeah? It's not something that's peripheral to language. It's not something that's added on. It's added value onto cognition or onto emotion. But it's the very stuff of politics. And this is the difference. Don't treat language or metaphor or identity as something that's added on. Yeah? It's not pepper or salt. Yeah? It's the very stuff of politics. Analyze it as such. Look for those identities and look what are they doing in situ. Look what are they doing in when they are relevant, as it were. You know, we don't need to know what goes on to people's heads in order to say, you're a right winger, as it were. We can look at how language is constructed along different lines. Now, if you want to read more on this, the perfect psychologist to go to is Steven Reicher. He's done some excellent work on the discourse, on the appeal of Donald Trump. You made the stuff on YouTube, the stuff that he done for the psychologist. I mean, they also done stuff for the American Psychological Association. And as a social psychologist with expertise in intergroup relation, he's as you can see, he's interested in the self and social identity. And he argues that the appeal of politicians, controversial politicians like Trump and others, lies in this dynamic of what he calls the dynamic of the variable self. So there's no point in us accusing Trump supporters of being stupid and accusing Trump himself of being silly. He is, but that's not a political statement, isn't it? But you have to look at how populist politics is being done. And according to him, populist politics is being done as collective mobilization. A politician is in the business of doing collective mobilization, of trying to work with social identity. Now, according to Reicher, and he uses Trump as an example, you can do this by trying to tick 3 boxes. Now, you can present yourself as a politician of the people, where you represent what makes the group unique. Look at the Trump's America First policy. Yeah? You can be the politician for the people, according to Reicher, where you act for the group interest. Yeah? When Trump is saying, no, only allow American companies to trade here, not anyone else. That's what he's doing. He's doing identity work. Of course, he's doing politics. He's doing more than that. But the message is in his identity positioning. And thirdly, you can be a politician to the people when you transform those group values into lived reality, as it were. And unfortunately, we've seen how Trump has done that. How he took America out of treaties, how what he said he'd done. Now, according to Reicher, if you manage to do that in your speeches, in your public appearances, you will get appeal by virtue of appealing to what our expectations in terms of social identity, as it were. It's an interesting argument. Again, I want to see whether you agree or disagree. I find it quite a powerful argument. That's an argument around social identity. It doesn't need any psychology attached to it. I don't need to know the psychology of Trump. I don't need to have him fill in a questionnaire and find out that he's got some kind of personality that's perhaps off the chart. But I can analyze his discourse, and I can see how he's in the business of collective mobilization, and that's what politics is done. If you look at the political elites, you look at Brexit and look at what happens in this country or anywhere else. Look for how collective mobilization is done, and you'll see it quite a lot. Once you start looking for it, you will see it here and here and here and here. Yeah, and you might find that you don't need to have some psychology that runs alongside it, as it were. Yeah. Again, I'll be the last one to argue against psychology. I'm a psychologist. We need psychology, but we need to be able also to look at political discourse in its own right. And if you look at rhetorical and discursive psychology, there's a few tools in there that researchers can use to analyze and to debate politics from a firmer ground. Yeah, we're not speculating. We're not insulting each other. Do you know what I mean? We need something that's scientific, so to speak, something that makes sense not just to us in the classroom, but also to others in the wider world. Yeah. Well, I wanna end this on a less pessimistic note. We also mock politicians quite a lot. I showed this to my students and they love it. Vote Conservative or I'll kill this kitten. That's a spoof David Cameron website, which was very popular in the UK a while ago, but it's still up, and it's a lovely material. You know, we mock Trump for his personality, as it were, and Theresa May, desperate Theresa May, wanting a boat to cross the channel, as it were. Yeah, so there's hope, but we need to look at those politicians and example of politics that would allow us to understand that as a phenomenon in its full complexity. And I'm going to end with just 2 points. Psychology is about society, not just about individuals, and this is the point I make in my political psychology. If you want to follow some of these leads, if you want to find some literature that supports some of my points, you can look at the book. Basically, what I argue there is that we need to shift the focus from internalist cognitivism to rhetorical self and social identity. And a lot has happened in social psychology since the book is written, but I think you'll find some background in that, and that can be the beginning of a conversation around social and political psychology. And I'll just stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you.